At 76, Richard Gere, the Hollywood icon once admired for his charm and unforgettable roles, now lives a life that many fans would never expect. Behind the glamour and fame lies a reality filled with solitude, health battles, and quiet struggles that break the image of the star we thought we knew. His story today is not about red carpets or romance, but about resilience in the face of aging. What he's facing now is as heartbreaking as it is eye-opening. Richard Gere's story feels almost like two different lives stitched together. There was a time when he was everywhere, his face on movie posters, his name lighting up marquees, his roles defining what it meant to be a Hollywood leading man. From the late 70s into the 90s, he wasn't just acting in films, he was shaping culture. Pretty Woman made him a romantic icon. An Officer and a Gentleman turned him into the ultimate heartthrob, and Chicago proved he could reinvent himself as a musical star. For years, it felt like Richard Gere could do no wrong. Every role seemed to build on the last, every performance added another layer to his reputation. But fame is never permanent. Slowly things began to change. While many actors of his generation adapted by moving into television or streaming, Gere chose to stay focused on film. It was a bold choice, but it limited his opportunities at a time when the industry itself was shifting. And then came the consequences of speaking out. Gere had always been more than an actor. He was a man of strong convictions, especially about Tibet and human rights. At the 1993 Oscars, when he used the stage to speak against China's actions, he knew it would upset people. What he didn't fully realize was how deeply it would cut into his career. China was becoming a massive market for Hollywood, and studios didn't want the risk. Offers slowed. Big roles went to others. Gere quietly stepped out of the spotlight. By the 2000s, he was still working, but the projects were smaller, often independent films with limited releases. Some of his performances during this period, like in Arbitrage or Norman, earned glowing reviews from critics, but they didn't bring back the kind of global attention he once commanded. For the casual moviegoer, it was as if Richard Gere had disappeared. Then the pandemic arrived, and his absence became even more pronounced. While other actors found ways to stay present through streaming projects, Gere chose family. He stayed home, raising two young sons with his wife Alejandra, living a life far removed from the flashing lights of Hollywood premieres. Now, at 76, the contrast is striking. The man who once embodied charm and glamour rarely appears in public. When he does, people notice how much he's changed. Not just in appearance, but in presence. He's quieter now, content to be a father and husband rather than the face of Hollywood romance. For fans who grew up watching him sweep Julia Roberts off her feet, the silence feels jarring. But maybe that's the point. Gere seems to have chosen this quiet, trading the noise of stardom for the calm of family and purpose. His story isn't about fading away. It's about stepping aside on his own terms. Richard Gere's career has never been the kind you could map out on a chart. Some actors seem to follow a carefully designed path, picking roles that build on each other, slowly climbing toward bigger and bigger opportunities. Gere was never like that. He admitted it himself more than once. He didn't plan his career, he just followed his instincts. That choice made his story unpredictable, filled with both brilliant highs and puzzling detours. But that unpredictability was also what made him stand out. He wasn't just another leading man. He was someone who refused to be boxed in, no matter how Hollywood wanted to shape him. When Gere first arrived on the scene in the 1970s, he had the looks and charisma that could have easily locked him into one type of role, the heartthrob. And for a while, that's exactly what Hollywood gave him. American Gigolo in 1980 cemented his image as a sex symbol, the kind of man women swooned over and men envied. The sleek suits, the confidence, the smoldering intensity, it was all there. But while that role launched him into stardom, Gere quickly showed he wasn't content to stay in that lane. 2 years later, he played a Navy officer in An Officer and a Gentleman, a film that could have easily been just another romantic drama, but became something deeper. It was about resilience, discipline, and the struggle to define yourself in a world that demands toughness. Gere's performance struck a chord, and suddenly he wasn't just a sex symbol anymore. He was a serious actor with staying power. But for every hit that built his reputation, there were choices that confused critics and audiences. Gere often picked films that didn't play it safe. Sometimes it worked brilliantly, like Pretty Woman in 1990, which became one of the most beloved romantic comedies of all time. His chemistry with Julia Roberts was lightning in a bottle, and it gave him a second career peak, this time as the ultimate romantic lead. Other times, though, his risks didn't pay off. Movies like Dr. T and The Women, or Amelia, didn't land with audiences, the box office numbers dipped, and critics were harsh. Still, Gere didn't seem shaken. He never chased what was popular just for the sake of keeping his star power alive. Part of that came from his personality. Gere was always deeply serious about the world around him. He was never just about fame and money. His activism, especially for Tibet, became as much a part of his identity as his acting. That commitment made him a hero to some, but a problem for Hollywood executives. After his 1993 Oscars speech condemning China's human rights abuses, studios started pulling away from him. China was becoming one of the biggest markets for films, and no studio wanted to risk angering the government by casting an actor they had banned. Gere's choice to speak out was risky. He knew it might cost him roles, but he did it anyway. And it did cost him. His career shifted away from blockbusters and into smaller, independent films. Yet here's the irony. Those smaller films gave him some of the best performances of his career. Arbitrage, in 2012, is a perfect example. It wasn't a massive Hollywood production, but Gere's portrayal of a corrupt businessman caught in a web of lies was so sharp, so compelling, that critics couldn't ignore it. He earned another Golden Globe nomination, proving that even without studio backing, his talent could still shine. He followed that with films like Norman in 2016, where he played a struggling fixer desperate to be seen. These roles weren't glamorous, but they were layered, messy, human, and they showed an actor willing to take risks, even when it meant leaving behind the safety net of mainstream Hollywood. The risks weren't only professional. Gere's personal life often drew headlines, and sometimes those headlines threatened to overshadow his work. He was linked with high preferential relationships, and his marriages, first to Cindy Crawford, later to Carrie Lowell, were constantly in the public eye. The gossip often painted him as difficult or overly serious, someone who didn't fit into the light-hearted Hollywood mold. But instead of trying to change his image to please the press, Gere leaned into who he was. He cared more about his faith, his activism, and his art than about whether people labeled him as difficult. That too was a risk. Hollywood doesn't always reward authenticity when it doesn't fit the brand. But Gere seemed fine with paying the price. As the years went on, his choices revealed something important. He valued meaning over momentum. While other actors of his generation scrambled to stay visible with big franchises or TV series, Gere slowed down. He took fewer roles but put more of himself into them. And when he stepped away for long stretches, especially during the pandemic, it wasn't out of defeat. It was out of choice. He chose to stay home with his young family, to spend time raising his children, to live a quieter life far from the Hollywood spotlight. That decision, like so many others, might have puzzled those who still saw him as the ultimate leading man. But for Gere, it was consistent with everything he had ever done. He lived on his own terms, even when it cost him. Looking back, Richard Gere's career is a story of risks that sometimes paid off in spectacular ways and other times left him standing outside of Hollywood's inner circle. But through it all, he never bent to fit what people expected. He didn't chase awards, even though many believe he deserved an Oscar. He didn't cling to franchises or safe roles to stay relevant. He spoke his mind, he followed his passions, and he kept working even when the projects weren't glamorous. At 76, that legacy may not look like the perfect Hollywood arc, but it's one that reflects integrity. Gere shaped his career by being willing to risk everything for what mattered to him: his values, his artistry, and ultimately, his own peace of mind. Richard Gere has always carried himself with an air of mystery. Fans saw him as the smooth, confident star of Pretty Woman and An Officer and a Gentleman, but behind the polished roles and red carpet appearances was a man who guarded his personal life fiercely. Unlike many celebrities who thrive on public attention, Gere seemed uncomfortable with it. He gave interviews because he had to, posed for cameras because it was part of the job, but when the lights dimmed, he pulled back into his own world. That separation between the actor and the man was deliberate, and it shaped how people saw him throughout his career. From early on, Gere made it clear he didn't want to be defined by the labels Hollywood tried to stick on him. When people called him a sex symbol, he bristled. To him, it was shallow and didn't reflect the depth of his passions or his identity. He once had his team contact a talk show host who had introduced him with that label, insisting it be removed from any future mention. It wasn't arrogance, it was a refusal to let others box him into an image that felt false. Gere cared deeply about being taken seriously, not just as an actor, but as a human being who had convictions, interests, and values beyond the screen. That seriousness came through in how he chose to live his private life. Gere didn't parade his relationships in front of the cameras. Even when he was married to high-profile figures like Cindy Crawford, one of the most famous models in the world, he avoided turning their marriage into a media circus. Instead, he often seemed uneasy with the constant attention, as if the fame that came with their union was more of a burden than a blessing. Later, with Carrie Lowell, and now with Alejandra Silva, his relationships followed the same pattern. He let the world see glimpses, but the heart of his family life stayed hidden. For Gere, love and family were sacred spaces, not publicity tools. His privacy also extended to his role as a father. Becoming a dad later in life reshaped his world in ways the public rarely saw. He wasn't the kind of celebrity to splash his kids across magazine covers or turn them into part of his brand. Instead, he quietly embraced the role, choosing to prioritize time at home over chasing every new film role. By the time his 2 young sons were born with Alejandra, Gere was already in his 70s. Many might see that as unusual or even impractical, but for him, it was a second chance to experience family with the wisdom age brings. He often spoke of his joy in being present for them, of savoring simple moments, of being less concerned about fame and more about being a steady presence in their lives. Behind the scenes, Gere's private world was also defined by his spirituality. His embrace of Buddhism wasn't a Hollywood fad, it was a personal journey that had guided him for decades. He found peace and purpose in meditation, in quiet reflection, and in the teachings he followed. This spiritual practice gave him a center, something stable to hold on to when the chaos of fame became overwhelming. It also explained why he often seemed detached from Hollywood politics and gossip. Gere wasn't chasing validation from the industry. He was chasing meaning, balance, and truth. But his private nature also made him appear distant at times. Colleagues described him as serious, even intense. He wasn't the life of the party, and he didn't try to charm his way through every interaction. Some people mistook that for arrogance, but those who knew him better said it was simply his way. Thoughtful, reserved, and uninterested in the shallow games of celebrity culture. He didn't need to be everywhere or know everyone. He was content with a smaller circle, with trusted friends and loved ones who understood him. Over the years, this distance from the public eye gave him both freedom and challenges. On one hand, it protected him from the constant scrutiny that destroys many stars. On the other, it made him a target for speculation. Because Gere rarely explained himself, rumors sometimes filled the silence. Whether it was about his career choices, his activism, or his relationships, the lack of explanation left space for people to create their own stories. But Gere never seemed interested in correcting the record. He simply lived his life quietly, allowing the world to talk, while he focused on what mattered to him. Now, in his mid-70s, the private man behind the fame is more visible than ever. Not because he's opened up, but because he no longer feels the need to perform off-screen. His home life in Spain with Alejandra and their children is far removed from Hollywood. His days are filled with family, spiritual practice, and the occasional role that speaks to him. He doesn't chase relevance, and he doesn't need to. He has built a life where peace matters more than attention. For fans who remember him as the charming heartthrob of the 80s and 90s, this quieter life may seem like a loss. But for Gere, it's the opposite. He has finally stepped into the life he wanted all along, a life not defined by fame, but by privacy, love, and purpose. The man behind the fame never really changed, he just finally allowed himself to live without the spotlight. Richard Gere's life has always been a blend of love stories, controversies, and a legacy that stretches far beyond the screen. To understand him fully, you can't just look at his filmography or his activism. You have to see the ways in which his personal choices, the whispers of scandal, and his deep commitment to values created a complicated but powerful picture of a man who never settled for the surface. His story has been written not only in the glow of Hollywood premieres, but also in the pages of tabloids, the quiet halls of Buddhist temples, and the hearts of millions who were touched by his work, his words, or his courage. Love has been a constant theme in Gere's life, though not always in ways the public understood. His marriage to Cindy Crawford in the 1990s remains one of Hollywood's most talked about relationships. They were a striking couple. She, one of the world's most famous supermodels, and he, a global film star. On paper, they looked perfect. But the glare of fame is not kind to private love, and theirs cracked under the pressure of being two icons constantly under a microscope. The tabloids dissected every outing, every glance, every rumor, until the marriage eventually dissolved. Many speculated on the reasons, from the 17-year age difference to clashing lifestyles, but what remained clear was that Gere never sought to turn his relationships into spectacles. He wanted love to be personal, but the world always demanded it be public. Later came his marriage to Carrie Lowell, which gave him a son, Homer, and for a time seemed to ground him. Gere often spoke of fatherhood as one of the most meaningful roles of his life. Yet even this relationship ended in divorce, a drawn-out legal battle that played out in front of cameras more than Gere would have liked. Divorce for celebrities is always fodder for gossip, but Gere's seriousness and preference for privacy clashed with the media's hunger for details. Once again, his personal life became a controversy he never wanted but couldn't escape. Then, in his 60s, Gere surprised the public by marrying Alejandra Silva, a Spanish activist and businesswoman decades younger than him. Critics raised eyebrows at the age gap, but Gere seemed unconcerned. What mattered to him was that he had found peace, love, and a partner who shared his values. Together they built a home in Spain, welcomed 2 sons, and began living a life far removed from the glitz of Los Angeles. For Gere, this love wasn't about appearances. It was about starting fresh, about building a family where privacy and purpose came first. Alejandra often describes him as a devoted father and husband, someone who puts family before everything else, and that image contrasts starkly with the glamorous star who once ruled Hollywood. But where there is love, there has also been controversy. Gere's activism has long been part of his identity, and while it earned him respect, it also brought backlash. His 1993 Oscars speech about Tibet marked a turning point. In that moment, Gere chose to use one of the world's biggest stages not to celebrate Hollywood, but to call out injustice. China responded by banning him, and Hollywood studios followed by quietly reducing the roles offered to him. It was the story of how he chose to make a film. Gere knew the cost, but didn't regret his choice. For him, speaking the truth was more important than preserving his marketability. That decision shaped the next decades of his career, pushing him toward independent films and away from the mainstream. To some, that was a fall from grace. To others, it was a mark of integrity. His humanitarian work extended beyond Tibet. Gere has been outspoken on AIDS awareness, human rights, and poverty. He poured time and money into causes that mattered to him, often disappearing from Hollywood gossip because he was halfway across the world working with charities or meeting leaders. These choices reinforced his reputation as someone who didn't play by Hollywood's rules. He wasn't chasing the biggest paycheck or the next blockbuster franchise. He was chasing meaning. Yet this very seriousness sometimes made him seem aloof, even unapproachable, in an industry built on charm and accessibility. That, too, became a source of controversy. Was Gere too difficult for Hollywood, or was he simply unwilling to play the game? Even outside of activism, smaller scandals followed him. Stories about disagreements with co-stars, his refusal to be labeled a sex symbol, and rumors about his private life swirled around him for decades. The media painted him as complex, sometimes difficult, but always fascinating. And through it all, Gere rarely defended himself in public. His silence often fueled speculation, but it also protected his private world. He seemed to understand that controversy is a storm you can't control, only endure. What remains, though, is his legacy. Richard Gere may not have the shelf of Oscars that some of his peers boast, but his impact on film and culture is undeniable. He gave audiences some of the most iconic romantic roles of all time. Pretty Woman remains a cultural touchstone more than 3 decades later, a film that turned him and Julia Roberts into an unforgettable duo. An Officer and a Gentleman gave us a love story that still defines the genre. Chicago proved his versatility, earning him awards and acclaim. These roles are part of Hollywood history, woven into the collective memory of audiences worldwide. But his legacy isn't just in the films. It's in the way he lived his life outside of them. Gere showed that an actor could care more about people than box office numbers, that fame could be used as a tool for awareness rather than self-promotion. He made choices that often cost him in terms of career opportunities, but gave him peace of mind and purpose. His legacy is one of courage to speak out, to take risks, to follow his own path even when it wasn't popular. Now at 76, Gere's legacy feels more like a mosaic than a straight line. It's love found and lost, family struggles, global activism, Hollywood highs and lows, and a quiet retreat into the life he always wanted. Fans still remember him as the leading man of their favorite films, but those who look closer see a man who refused to be only that. His life story isn't neat or simple. It's layered with passion, conflict, mistakes, and triumph. When people look back decades from now, they may not remember every box office number or every scandal. What they will remember is that Richard Gere stood for something, that he left behind not just performances, but a reminder that legacy isn't about perfection, it's about authenticity. And in a world that often demands masks, Gere's willingness to show his true self, even at great cost, may be the most lasting legacy of all.